Okay, it is just after 1 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. So I'm Stefanie Murray, Director of the Center for Cooperative Media here at Montclair State University. This center is a grant-funded program of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State, and we support local journalism. One of the ways that we do that is through our national program that studies collaborative journalism. So you're here for the Introduction to Collaborative Journalism webinar. So hopefully you're in the right spot. If you didn't mean to be at this webinar, now is a good time to leave, but that's what we'll be talking about over the next 30 to 60 minutes. And we're gonna go ahead and mute everyone. Thanks, Joe, for helping me with that. Joe Amditis from the center is also going to be assisting with the webinar today.
Hey, everybody.
So we've got a presentation that we'll go through together. That's about 30-ish or so minutes. And while I'm talking, since we have a very small group, you can feel free to interrupt me. You can also drop any questions that you have in the chat too. And then after we go through the presentation together, we will just open it up for Q&A. I need to shut off my email too. It's beeping a lot. Can everybody hear that every time I get a new email?
No.
No? Okay, good, good. And that's that. So we will go ahead and get started. Like I said, you're with Introduction to Collaborative Journalism today, and we can go to the next slide, and I'm Stefanie Murray. One thing it's important for us to note is that this is the first of a series of webinars that we'll be hosting this year about different topics related to collaborative journalism, and this is all thanks to support from Rita Allen Foundation. We're very grateful to Rita Allen for a grant that's helped us expand our training materials and resources around collaborative journalism. So thanks to them for their support. So we're going to start by talking about what is collaborative journalism. So we define collaborative journalism as news organizations working together and with non-news entities to produce journalism. That's how we broadly define it. It's journalists that are working across company lines, across traditional competitive boundaries in journalistic endeavors. And we also, more and more now, we see news organizations partnering with each other and with non-news organizations on short or long-term projects. And so some prolific collaborators that we'll be talking about today that often pop up, some of the leaders in this field include ProPublica, the International Center for Investigative Journalism, and of course the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So to start with, I like to talk about the history of collaborative journalism. So collaboration is not a new concept by any means. In our research report comparing models of collaborative journalism, which we published in 2017, our researcher, Sarah Stombley, the author of that report, reviewed a brief history of collaboration. And she noted that one of the earliest forms of collaboration and cooperation in the United States was the Associated Press, which began in 1846, when 6 New York newspapers joined to form the AP and start cooperating and sharing news. The practice has evolved since then, and it really has always existed since then in various forms, although it's often overshadowed by competition in our industry. So we can consider some business cooperatives as forms of collaboration. JOAs in that respect can be looked at as collaborative efforts. One notable marker in the history of project-based collaborations I like to point out too is the work of New America Media and New California Media in the 90s, which organized quite a few different reporting projects among ethnic media organizations. We see that the current excitement around collaborative journalism really began to take off in the mid-2000s. Digital networking really expanded what we could do together, and that's when we started to see more outside funders putting money into collaborations. The Knight Foundation founded JLab with Jan Schaefer in 2009, and that started 9 newsroom collaboratives, of which I think 3 or 4 are still active today. And that same year, that's when CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, started funding journalistic collaboratives. And they've put close to, I think maybe even more than $40 million into supporting collaboratives since they started that. In 2014, Pew declared a new interest of journalism, new era of interest in journalism partnerships. We saw the Panama Papers and launch in early 2016, and then of course 2016 was when the first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded to collaborative efforts. One thing that's also important to note is that longtime partnerships have existed between ethnic and community media that often don't get mentioned when we talk about collaboration, but they are an important part of the collaborative landscape in the history. So we want to talk about what the state of collaboration is now. So collaboration is becoming increasingly common and widely accepted in the journalism industry, and among who we're going to talk about in a moment. If you flip to the next slide for a second for me too, Joe. So we consider 2016 to be a watershed year in many ways, as I mentioned before, in the broader history of journalism, because that's when the Panama Papers published, which is still to date the largest and the most sophisticated journalism collaboration in history, and arguably one of the most impactful. That's year election land was executed, that's when documenting hate began, and that's when those 2 Pulitzer Prizes were awarded to collaborative projects. Now we'll go back to the next slide, thank you. So today we see short-term project-based collaboratives happening all the time, and we're seeing more and more long-term cooperatives being formed. So projects are becoming more sophisticated. This whole area is being studied more as its own approach to journalism. That's what we do here at the center. We're starting to see even more outside funding continuing to be invested in collaboratives. That's often because funders see that they can make a bigger impact, reach a bigger audience by helping multiple news organizations that have different strengths, expertise, and audiences to team up and work together toward a shared goal. And again, we've recently seen Pulitzer Prizes awarding collaborative projects. ONA recently added a collaboration and partnership category to its OJAs. And of course, we have the annual conference that the center hosts, the 2020, coming up, the Collaborative Journalism Summit, the 2021, which will be May 14th and 15th. So now I'd like to show a video. So this is the state of collaboration video that we showed at last year's summit. One of the reasons why I like to show it is because it will go over some of the things we just talked about, but it'll also give you a good picture of other projects happening.
Over the last 5 years, collaborative journalism has gone from a little-known and largely untrusted method of reporting to a strong, vibrant, and growing component of the media industry. Journalism outlets have been turning to collaboration as a way to share data and expertise, to take advantage of digital tools, stretch resources, and to grow their audience, all during a time when the competitive landscape has shifted. No longer are most media organizations competing head-to-head with each other. Competition today is for time and attention, and it's against social media platforms, gaming apps, search engines that personalize content discovery, and much more. Collaborative journalism is also gaining steam in part due to the massive economic and technological disruption that's destroyed some of the industry's core business models. Working in partnership is one way that news organizations, especially local outlets, can still tackle big and complex projects that serve the public interest in their communities.
When we say collaborative journalism, we're talking about journalists working across traditional media boundaries and across their own company lines to partner with other organizations to share story ideas, sources, tips, leads, and to together develop content that otherwise they would not have been able to do on their own. Today, by collaborating, we can leverage the power of many organizations all together to focus on stories that can have a big impact on multiple communities and can help solve problems together.
There are 5 big trends that we're seeing right now when it comes to collaborative journalism. Trend number 1 is that more collaborations are happening.
The number of collaborative projects we're seeing in the United States has grown quite a bit over the last 3 years. The number that have been launched in the last year alone is impressive. In late 2017, we started tracking collaborative projects in a database on collaborativejournalism.org, and lately it's been really hard to keep up. These new efforts are spread out across the entire country. Over the last 12 months, we've seen new collaborations in California, Texas, North Carolina, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Detroit, Denver, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and the list goes on. And we think it will continue to grow as more journalists adapt the practice.
What I have seen is that we find less and less reluctance from newsroom cultures and newsroom executives and editors to face collaborations. There's more willingness to work together, being open to work with local newsrooms, with people who have very different expertises or skill sets, I think that we have seen very successful experiments over the last 5 years that have convinced somehow that this is something worth investing in, despite the crazy 24/7 news cycle everybody is like sucked into.
The second trend is that more local newsrooms are participating in collaborations.
We're seeing a shift from collaborations largely being done or led by big news organizations and nonprofits, such as the Panama Papers or ProPublica and its many projects, to more local collaborations. News organizations in specific cities, regions, or states who are partnering.
When we talk about more local collaborations, the California Reporting Project is one example where more than 30 news organizations teamed up to pool and review newly released police misconduct records. In North Carolina, 11 news organizations partnered with Carolina Public Press on Seeking Conviction, a series about sexual assault and the law. Meanwhile, in Atlantic City, Stories of AC is an initiative that pairs a group of community members and a half-dozen media partners to produce a series of restorative narrative stories. And there are many, many other examples. Trend number 3 is that more people are being hired specifically as collaboration managers.
As the number of collaborations grows in the United States, especially local projects, and as the focus turns more from why journalists should collaborate to how to do it, we're seeing a rise in the employment of collaboration managers. This is because successful collaborative projects usually have someone running them, or at least a single point of contact for everyone involved. There are now at least 24 people in the United States whose jobs are specifically to manage collaborative journalism projects.
Trend number 4, more formal collaboratives are launching.
We're seeing formal, ongoing collaboratives being started. Networks like the New Jersey News Commons, Ohio Valley Resource, Alaska's Energy Desk, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, and the Northwest News Network have been joined by Resolve Philadelphia, the Bay Area Media Collaborative, the Colorado Media Project, the Granite State News Collaborative, Bridge Pittsburgh, and more.
Broken Philly is a collaboration of 19 local news organizations in Philadelphia doing dedicated reporting on solutions to poverty and how America's poorest big city moves towards economic justice. And so I think really the collaborative nature of this project could potentially mean that we're able to kind of shift the entire public narrative on poverty in Philadelphia. You know, it's a city that for the last decade has had a poverty rate that's been the highest in the country, 26%. Half the city can't actually struggles to make ends meet without some sort of external financial assistance. And so by having a critical mass of local news organizations who are not just looking at the nature of the problem, you know, systemic and historical contributing factors, but potential solutions, we have the possibility to actually, you know, really engage stakeholders who have the potential to make change in this area.
And trend number 5 is an increase in the number of projects based on shared data and documents.
As local newsrooms test out collaboration as a way to tackle big projects, one place where they see value is in sharing data and documents. And organizations like the Solutions Journalism Network and Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting are launching and supporting multiple collaboratives.
So the most challenging thing about doing this collaboration is doing the collaboration. I'm really committed to making sure that we have kind of a full spectrum of participation. And so that means even the smallest community news organization or an Asian, African American, Latino news organization, and often these groups have small staffs, very limited resources. And so how do we knit together or create a structure by which big organizations and small organizations can work together, and so that they all feel like they're a part of it, nobody's being exploited, and that we're enriched by that. And so I spend a lot of my time cajoling those who unfortunately have the least resources to be involved, and we're trying to figure out what's the best way to help them be involved.
So, what's next for collaborative journalism throughout 2019 and into 2020? It's likely that we'll continue to see additional local news collaborations, especially those with a renewed focus on equitable partnerships, specifically with ethnic and community media. We also expect to see more and deeper partnerships on stories with community members and organizations, as well as external funding of collaborative work, a focus on how to better collaborate by developing and sharing best practices, and more emphasis on measuring the impact of our projects.
I think the most exciting element about collaborative journalism today is the emphasis on impact. I think the point of collaborative journalism is really to get at the heart of what we want to do as journalists. We want to have impact. We want to protect the public good. We want to hold the powerful to account. And when you take out elements of competing with one another, when you use force multipliers like working together and collaboration, that's only going to make that easier and more effective.
So as I mentioned, a lot of things that we'll be talking about during the rest of the webinar are things that that were touched on in that video. And Joe shared the link in the chat, so that's fantastic. Please share that with anyone that you think could benefit from watching it. So who is collaborating? There are certain types of media organizations that have been better collaborators than others and have been doing it for a longer period of time. And so at the top of that list is absolutely public media. So this is in part due to the investment from CPB over the years, but public media and nonprofits are the two types of media organizations that we see in our study of collaborative journalism that are doing more collaborating than almost anyone else. We see more independent media and alternative news media joining today as well. News startups are often built with collaboration in mind from the beginning. More formal cooperatives are leading collaboration and bringing in all of these different types of entities. We see our focus really has been on studying collaboration in the United States, but there's a lot of different international media that have been collaborating. And that's in part thanks to the work of organizations like the International Center for Journalists, as well as ICIJ, the Global Investigative Journalist Network, and others. And we are seeing more legacy media. By legacy media, I mostly mean newspapers and television coming to the table, but they're at the bottom of that list for a reason. So the list of who is collaborating is long and growing all the time. These are some of the organizations that that we mentioned earlier that are common collaborators. You can't quite see all of them because they're supposed to fly in differently. There they go. WNYC is one that we work with quite a bit here. We mentioned the New Jersey News Commons, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. Richland Source is a great example of an independent news organization that's involved in collaborations, and the list goes on. Also, I talked about, go to the next slide, how international media has been collaborating. And so we are seeing more formal collaboratives launching around the world. Much of this, a chunk of this is actually due to fact-checking initiatives, many of them that have involved or been led by First Draft. If you don't know what First Draft News is, Google that and we can tell you more, but they've been leading different fact-checking collaboratives in many different parts of the world. Media has also led some of these efforts like Verificado in Mexico. And of course, thanks to the work of the organizations I mentioned a moment ago, there are more collaborative projects happening cross-border. So who is not collaborating? This list is short, thankfully, and it's getting shorter seemingly every day. So commercial television is the one big area of the media industry, especially in the United States, that are not as involved in many of the collaborative projects. And we hear often from folks we talk to who are considering collaborative efforts to approach a topic, that they have a really hard time getting anyone to pay attention to them who works in commercial television. This is changing in some places, but still they are definitely at the top of the list. Newspapers, I would also add to this list, although that is also changing, and that's changing much more quickly than commercial television. So newspapers are joining in, if you go to the next slide. So, and there we go. So one example from a couple of years ago I like to point to is a collaboration between the New York Times and the Times-Pick in, used to be the Times-Pick in New Orleans. They did, and that was actually the first collaborative project that the New York Times was involved in. Also in New Orleans, that same year, I think Clear Health Costs worked with WVUE, Fox 8 down there, and the Times picked to team up on a healthcare series. So that was a good example, back to back in New Orleans, of newspapers and commercial television coming to the table. Also recently, we've seen collaboration in Florida. Several newspapers have joined a partnership for covering climate change. And very recently in North Carolina, the North Carolina News Collaborative was announced, and that involves currently only newspapers. The Charlotte Journalism Collaborative also is a great example of an ongoing collaborative that has a very active commercial television partner too. So those are all good things. Why collaborate? So Heather Bryant of Project Facet says this best, so the credit for this list and this slide really goes to her. The best reason to collaborate is to make a greater impact and to serve the public interest better than you could have on your own. That's why you should consider partnering. That's what we often tell folks. You can partner to get access to resources that you wouldn't have on your own, to make your coverage more diverse in thought and in perspective, to bring in expertise that might not exist at your organization. That's a big one that drives a lot of partnerships. It can help expand reach to larger audiences, to improve access in some cases to sources or topics that otherwise might be out of reach, to exert greater influence as a collective, and of course, to help focus attention on a particular topic or a particular issue. So we've identified roughly 5 common ways that collaborations start. And I've been thinking about revising this list, but it still stands from what we've studied to date. So the first is that collaborations are often inspired by an upcoming event that everyone's going to cover anyway. Elections are an easy example, but also planned protests, a big speaker coming to town, some event in time that we all know. That is a very common way that collaborations start, around that event. A second way is that they're often inspired by an impending or a looming crisis that everyone will cover. Detroit's bankruptcy was a good example. That's how the Detroit Journalism Cooperative got its start, as are stories around the opioid crisis, of which we've seen several impactful collaborations across the country. Third, they are often inspired by a lead partner who just initiates conversations about others, about teaming up on a particular enterprise topic. Examples of this are Sea Level Rise, Philly's Reentry Project, or the San Francisco Homeless Project. This usually involves a level of trust that already exists between reporters or editors, too, I would note. A fourth way is that sometimes they're inspired by a partner who's just having trouble cracking a story on their own and needs help to do it effectively. The Panama Papers actually is a great example here, in that there was a cache of documents that one news organization knew that they could not do themselves. The California Reporting Project, I would also put in this category too. All the news organizations knew that everyone requesting these police records, newly released police misconduct records, all on January 1st for all the municipalities in that state was going to be a huge undertaking. And they could do it more effectively and then crack those stories if they work together. And the fifth way is sometimes they're inspired by a partner who brings resources to the table in terms of funding, like they want a grant or other support. And part of the catch is that they have a collaboration built into their work. So let's talk about models of collaboration for a moment. So in our research that I mentioned earlier in the webinar, comparing models of collaborative journalism, we created a matrix. Sarah Stonbely, the author of that report, created a matrix that defines the models of collaboration by time and level of integration. And then we mapped projects onto that matrix. So we see projects that are short-term and those that are long-term and ongoing. After that, we see projects in which partners separately create content, such as the San Francisco Homeless Project I mentioned a second ago, which we'll look at a little more in a moment. That involved 80 newsrooms who all agreed to do news stories about homelessness at a particular time. That's a separate creating content. We also look at creating content together, which is a higher level of integration. That involves things like maybe reporters co-working on a story, or there's cross-editing, all the way to full integration. And so this page is hard to see here, but it's at collaborativejournalism.org/models. That's where this full research paper is. And this is the matrix from our report where we defined these one-time finite projects, the ongoing projects, and then those 3 levels of integration I mentioned, and then mapped some projects on here. So I mentioned the San Francisco Homeless Project. So that is what we consider a one-time project. And it was one where partners separately created content and shared it. That's often where we see reporting collaboration start, reporting projects start, is a one-time project. Everyone agrees to do the same topic, but they're going to produce their content separately and then share it. That's a very easy way for organizations that have not collaborated before to test this and to try it. And then going down the matrix, we see things that are very integrated and ongoing, such as the Next to Die project with the Marshall Project, where they worked with news organizations to collect and share information about folks on death row and then co-reported stories out together. And so we have some tip sheets also available at collaborativejournalism.org/models. And this is one of the main tip sheets that you can find there. So we often share this with folks if they're thinking about a collaborative reporting project, to think through which model might work for what you're thinking about. And we find that this matrix, and thinking about it in terms of if this is going to be a one-time project or an ongoing project, and how integrated are we going to be, can help folks put some definition around the work that they're going to do. So some of the important projects that I would mention, we looked at several of these important projects in the video that we watched earlier, and we've talked about several of these already, like the Panama Papers or Documenting Hate or Next to Die. Election Land is another important project that I often mention that's going to be replicated in 2020. That was an effort to cover problems at the polls that was led by ProPublica with help from Google. Involved several academic institutions and dozens of newspapers around the country. I also mention as one of another highly important project is the Reentry Project, which led into Resolve Philadelphia, which you saw Jean earlier in the video talk a little bit about that project. So people often ask us about successful projects. What makes a successful project? And there definitely are some components that we see shared among projects that appear to be successful. One is a clear common goal. Collaborative projects that have a goal defined together at the beginning are often the ones that end up being successful. Along with that, a clear shared vision for what the end product is going to look like is incredibly important. All the way down to the details of where is this going to publish, where is it going to broadcast, how many podcast episodes are we going to do, and really clearly defining what that looks like. A project manager. This is number 1 on the list. Collaborative projects need someone or some entity to help them run smoothly. Someone who's in charge. Someone can herd the cats and keep the project going. We see more projects that are defining who that is at the very beginning, whereas I would say a couple of years ago when we were studying these projects, that often was a little more haphazard. There would be a group of editors and reporters working together, and they'd all be working together, and then they would realize halfway through that we need one person who's going to set up the conference calls and make sure everything's shared in Google Drive. But today we see this role being defined more. And as we saw mentioned in the video earlier, there are more people being actually hired for this role, either in a part-time or in sometimes a full-time capacity. We run a collaboration managers monthly call. And when we started, we had a couple dozen people on that call, and there are close to 50 people now across the United States, and we're adding more international as well. Funding can be important for successful projects. As we talked about, we have been seeing more outside funding coming in to support collaborative efforts, and those that have some extra funding to help offset costs of the collaboration or offset the participation of the members can lead to a more successful project. A basic written agreement. We have a collection of MOUs that are on our website that we're happy to share with you if you want to look at some of these, but having something written down makes a big difference. Some of the organizations we study absolutely don't write anything down. But we find that those that have something written, that can make a big difference. And there are some collaborative contracts that are very detailed legal agreements. And then successful projects, we often see that there is a relationship between the people who are working together, either one that existed before they started the collaboration or one that they intentionally try to grow while they're working together. So I'm going to grab a few of these important projects that we talked about earlier and just go through why they were successful mapped against some of those components. So in the case of the Panama Papers, that project had a very clear goal: analyze this trove of documents, pull out stories. And they involved dozens and dozens of news organizations in multiple countries, multiple languages, across multiple continents. They had project managers there. They had a dedicated team of project managers with its own hierarchy within those project managers within ICIJ that ran that project. They had resources, they had money. ICIJ is independent now and had funding to pursue this project. They had very detailed legal agreements. They actually developed shared technology upon which the collaboration was in part built. There were relationships that some of them existed, which is why Süddeutsche Zeitung went to ICIJ to begin with, and others that were developed along the course of the project. That project had size and scope and had very impactful content. When we look at Shy Vote, so Shy Vote was a collaborative voters guide that involved a group of 10 news organizations and a couple of non-news partners. In this project, it was successful in part, again, it had a very clear vision and goal, and also a deadline. They were doing a collaborative voters guide that then turned over and showed election results after the election. Very clear goal. It was all online. It involved not just media, like I mentioned, there were also, I think, 1 or 2 civic organizations involved. They had that clear deadline. They did have an MOU that was written, and they had weekly meetings and some shared technology on the back end. The third one, last one I'll point out, is the California Reporting Project. That started with a known upcoming dump of data that needed to be collected. California was making, on January 1st, 2019, available for the first time police misconduct records. And that made a very single, clear goal: collect all those records and put them in a place where we can all analyze them and pull out stories. Had a specific deadline, started January 1st, 2019. There was some project management. Early on, there were relationships that were already developed from other collaboratives in California, especially with KPCC. And so they started to lead the collaborative, and then at a point, Adrienne Hill stepped forward from that organization to help lead the collaborative. And so she took over as kind of quasi project manager. And I say quasi because that's how she described herself to me when we talked about it. They had relationships there too. So in the California Reporting Project, there had been other temporary one-time projects that had been done in that state, as well as some ongoing collaboratives. And they told me that they really depended on that when they built this project. And then they set up regular communication, regular calls. So some roadblocks, there are definitely things that get in the way, and this list is not exhaustive. These are just some of the top things that we see and we hear from people that tell us that their project either was not successful or was not as successful as they wanted it to be, or it just wasn't a good experience. These are some of the things that we see happen. The technology issue is a big one. Technology that is just not compatible. There are some platforms that are being developed and are in the field now that help smooth over collaboration, but it's just a fact of the matter that most collaborative projects being done in the United States currently hack together several different tech platforms. They have conversations on Slack. They keep things in Google Docs. There's a group of people who email. To get things in from one CMS to the other, it's, drop it here, put it in Dropbox, send me those photos separately. How am I going to get that video? It's huge. There's not one solution. There are, like I mentioned, some platforms. Project Facet I mentioned earlier, designed by Heather Bryant, is an example of that. Excuse me. Another roadblock is editing disagreements. So once you get to that second level of integration, and you're looking at projects that have content that's co-created, we're all journalists. We all know within our own newsrooms, we have editors who don't agree on the way a story should be structured or the way a package should be cut together. And that extends, and that's a roadblock when you have those more integrated collaborative projects. Personality conflicts, don't need to say anything more about that. That can often get in the way. A lack of buy-in at the top. We've seen some projects where we've got reporters or editors who are really interested in doing the work, but there is leadership at the top that sees it as they don't want to work with their competitors, and that can get in the way and can completely derail projects. Equity, especially for smaller news organizations, ethnic and community media, I'd call out, and we mentioned that in the video that you saw earlier, is an issue and is something that we think should be talked about more. And we're actually working on a guide to address equity issues and collaborations that we hope to publish in the coming months. Coordinated rollout, this is simple, but it can just leave a bad taste in folks' mouth when you're supposed to publish on Monday and someone presses the button on Friday. And that happens more frequently than I would have thought, that how do we do this coordinated rollout gets in the way. Well, we have our broadcast at 11 p.m. That's really important. And well, we go, to press at 6, and just having those issues figured out. And then a commitment to share content, but nobody does it. This happens all the time. It happens with the collaborations we run too, here in New Jersey, that folks are really excited about being part of a collaborative, and they participate and they work on topics together, they create their content, but then they only run what they produced. So those are some of the roadblocks. And so as you can imagine, the remedies, the next slide, map directly to those and are mapped to the components of successful projects that we talked about earlier. So agreeing on a clear goal, clear vision, understanding each other's strengths, and then capitalizing on them is important. And having an open conversation early on about what your strengths might be without assuming what the other organization might be really good at is important. Getting to know each other, take some time, spend some time together is important. Be very intentional about equitable partnering and write it down. Those are some of the remedies that we often talk about, and they sound more simple than they actually are in real life. So for more information about everything we just talked about, and we can share links to this with everyone after the webinar today. So we maintain collaborativejournalism.org, which is where we've been trying to link to all the resources and guides that are being produced. As we mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, collaborative journalism is a practice that's starting to be studied on its own, and we're trying to do our very best to capture as much as we can about the practice on that website. The Comparing Models of Collaborative Journalism research paper I mentioned, the video we watched, the database that you saw earlier on. Solutions Journalism Network has a fantastic collaborative journalism playbook that we'll send you a link to. Heather Bryant, we mentioned earlier, also has a great collaborative journalism workbook. And in addition to her workbook, we are producing a set of guides that we'll share and we'll be publishing this spring. These webinars, and then of course we hope that you all come to the 2020 Collaborative Journalism Summit, which will be May 14th and 15th in Charlotte, North Carolina. So 40 minutes on the dot. So questions. So I will be quiet for a moment and see if anyone who's been on the call has any questions, anything that you want to talk about, any things that didn't seem right to you or that you wanted to explore more.
I have unmuted everyone, so go ahead and speak, except for Delaney and DeSeo. Looks like you have to unmute manually.
And if you have no questions, that's fine too.
Okay, I'll start.
All right.
So I have a project that I've been thinking needs to be a collaborative project. It's actually about a case involving a Black man who was killed at the hands of police in the 1960s in San Antonio, and the medical examiner who ruled it police brutality was run off for his ruling. And the obvious partners include the newspaper that wrote about it at the time. But now, thanks to this thing, I'm thinking about also the the Black newspaper, the San Antonio Observer, which actually did not publish during those 2 years. In all of its years of publishing, it didn't publish during those 2 years. But that publisher seems like a really good person to bring into the mix. And there is a digital FM station, KROV, which was founded by the guy who founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee chapter here in San Antonio in the 60s, which was a big supporter of the Medical Examiner. And he just founded that radio station a couple years ago. So it's really kind of interesting that you're making me think way beyond the usual suspects.
Which is good. And, oftentimes what we hear from folks who say, but I feel like I have to have the newspaper. Don't I have to have the newspaper or the big news organization to do a project? And it just depends. Like, it can improve your reach. You could also have a different relationship with them too. Like it just depends. But I would absolutely encourage you to have some conversations with some of those other partners. Yeah, for sure.
I think the newspapers they wrote the stories, and I used to work there, and I'm friends with people who think that this is a really good story.
That's awesome.
bringing in the Black media particularly as an equitable partner. Thank you. That's super, super important. Because they don't have a lot of resources like me, but they do have an audience that's hugely important.
Yes, absolutely, and equitable and from the beginning is really important. People often think that equitable just has to mean money. If there's money, we all get a share of the cut, but that's definitely not the entire definition of equity and collaborations.
Yeah. Cool.
Then Jennifer just dropped something in the chat, said, the biggest hurdle for her is collaboration with people who are not journalists, community organizers, advocates, etc. They want to control the narrative after more context. That's interesting. So we are seeing more non-news partners joining collaborations, and that's one of our other guides that we'll be producing that actually Heather Bryan is working on writing, is tips for looking at how you can better collaborate with non-news partners. And we are starting research next month looking at how journalists and NGOs collaborate, or how they could potentially collaborate. And the goal for that work, Jennifer, is in part to lay out some guidelines and some recommendations to put some rules of the road down that are commonly shared. So one of the things that we tried here that worked when we were working with non-journalists in some of our projects is brought them in at the very beginning, made sure that they were equitable partners, but we'd had a little bit of, I wouldn't call it education, but it was kind of education between the groups, and that we had the journalists who were involved in the collaboration talk about how they find stories, how they decide what's a story and what's not. They talked about the ethics of how they decide things. And we had almost an hour-long conversation together about that. And that was actually pretty eye-opening, I think, for the community folks who were in the room, because it was a safe space. We were breaking bread together, talking about this. There was no attacking, there was no blame, but it set a good baseline, and that helped us then continue. Then we did have a couple points during that collaboration where some of the journalists involved were uncomfortable with suggestions from community members, and thought that, in particular, one community member may have just been pushing their own personal agenda. And so we talked about that pretty openly on one of our calls. We brought it up and said, so-and-so is worried that so-and-so journalist is worried that so-and-so community member may be suggesting story ideas that benefit his or her business or his or her friends. So let's talk about that, because that would violate the ethics that we talked about at the beginning. And we had an open conversation about that. That's not always possible, but that helped us. Someone else who I found is really good at navigating these is Fernando Diaz at the Chicago Reporter. He's put together and worked on a couple of collaborative efforts that have involved non-news entities, and has been just a master at navigating it. And so it's something that we, like I mentioned earlier, we hope to study and put more guidelines out about. I hope that helps a little bit. Cool. So if there's any other questions or anything that anyone else wants to chat about, you have the floor. If not, we can wrap up. All right. Well, thank you all. Thanks for being here. And so afterward, we'll share the recording with you. So if you wanted to share it with anyone else or rewatch it for something, you're more than welcome to do that. And I'm just very thankful that you joined us today. So have a good rest of your day and afternoon.